It is Sunday, March 14th, 2021, and you're listening to the PoGo Weekly Digest on PoGo Politics and Government for People of Color. This week, we're going to be doing 1 year with COVID-19, so there wasn't really much in that intro. And of course, I'm doing it with the lovely folks. Joining me on the West Coast is Beacon, on the East Coast is Vega. Hello, everyone. How are you?
Doing all right, and yourself?
It's good. I've had a quiet week, and I got my first dose of COVID-19 vaccination, which I was super excited about. I go back for my second dose next month, so that was really good. It felt good. I was elated. It was a very intense and emotional experience, but we'll talk about that later. It was a good week. It was quiet, and it's been a very relaxing weekend. I have been watching RuPaul's Drag Race UK. I don't know if anybody's watched the UK version, but season two, I've been very disenchanted with RuPaul's Drag Race in general, but the US version, I
Because of
just
the
feel like,
transphobia?
well, for so many reasons, including the transphobia.
All the fracking?
I mean, it's so problematic. The whole show is problematic, just like RuPaul. But I feel like the show really left like its origins of like, what it was really like, showcasing drag queens and like the broad spectrum of like everything that drag queens do. And I felt like Drag Race UK was a little bit more of that. But that's it. Other than that, there's nothing else new with me. How about you, Vega? How are you?
Good. Pretty much all I've been doing is just more job applications, dealing with insurance, adult stuff. But I did check out on when my stimulus check is going to be coming in, and it's coming in on Wednesday. So as I was just telling Freddie, this should be the last time I do this on my iPhone, and I'll be doing it from a computer next time.
Ooh, how glamorous.
I
It's
know. I feel so
exciting.
fancy.
It'll be even more high def Vega, so we can see all of your more like your
Yeah.
hairstyles, the coloring.
We'll
I tell
definitely have a new angle, but I gotta make it look interesting.
Yes.
I tell people all the time that because of the age of Zoom, because of COVID-19, I'm a voyeur. And so I love to see into people's homes. And during Zoom calls, I'm totally like looking at everything that I can about the atmosphere that the person is in. So I be peeping like backgrounds when Beacon does their nails, like all the new hairdos. I see all of the stuffs. So I can't wait for the more high def experience of Vega.
Do we need to have
The
like
high def.
a tour of each of our homes? The very, very low scale architectural digest of all of our bedrooms or whatever that we're
Like
using to
MTV
film in.
Cribs, the Pogo Pod Cribs,
Yeah, I was about to say
Yeah.
the
Pokemon.
Pogo Pod Cribs edition.
Oh God. After that comes the spin-off, Where's the Pimp My Ride edition? Which, by the way,
We're
come
starting
to
off by
think of it,
pimping
it
Vega's
would be nice to get a
computer.
really cool, nice car.
Listen, cars are great. I have to say, before we check in with Beacon, I will ask you how you're doing, Beacon, by the way. People that move to Chicago often talk about how great the public transportation is and the CTA this and the CTA that. As a person who grew up here and grew up on public transportation, like taking the bus, taking the train, as soon as I came of age where I could afford and have a car, I was like, fuck public transportation. Like, not fuck it, right? Because it's an absolutely necessary. Like, there are people that absolutely need it, but I never ever want to be on the damn train or the damn bus ever again. And I don't know
And
why
that's
I told that
interesting
story.
too,
There was
because
some
it's like
sort of connection I was making, but I really don't know why I told that
I'm sure there
story.
was.
In my mind, there was a connection, but now I don't know what it was.
Oh my
With that,
God.
Beacon, how are you?
I'm doing great. I do have a car, which is very nice. I'll be honest. It's kind of funny that just as a quick aside, like being born and raised in California, we take cars for granted, and because in so many parts of California we just have shitty public transportation, especially here in Southern California, and so just like it's a weird thing where, having the privilege of having cars, like it makes me long for the idea, like the ability to take public transportation to work on a regular basis. And the few times that I have, commuted via public transportation, like you're just like, it's like you see all the people, like, wetting themselves on the train, and you're just like, yes, I want to be able to enjoy this experience on a regular basis, but I don't think I would. It's that whole thing of like with a train is like tilting forward, then it goes downwards, but then it tilts back, and then it goes down the other way. And anyways, sorry.
Well, here's the thing.
I'm
The thing
doing
about
all
public
right.
transportation is that it's not accessible. And so the one time
No.
that like
Oh,
I
no.
used public transportation to get to and from work was when I worked downtown, and I broke my ankle during that year, and I quickly discovered that the Chicago public transportation is not set up for people that are not able-bodied. And so there are like stairs, there are some stations don't have elevators, and if they do have elevators, they're often not functioning. They're also slow as hell. People often get trapped in the elevators. They usually smell of urine, and so it was not a pleasant experience. I'm sure that like it would be a fun experience if you're like, oh, I've driven everywhere my whole life. But I'm at the point where I'm like, no, thank you. I don't want to hop on the bus. I don't want to hop on the train.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've Duke and I have talked about it, that the current plan is that I am going to be applying for grad schools at the end of this year, and crossing my fingers that I get into one next year. We would be moving out of state somewhere, and hopefully somewhere that has good public transportation, because between the two of us, we'll only have one car, and so one of us is going to have to rely on public transportation to a certain extent at some point. So hopefully we actually do go to a place that has public transportation, and then we can have this conversation a year and a half from now, and I will be complaining about taking public transportation everywhere. So
Yeah.
it'll be a nice full circle moment for me.
The whole purpose of moving is just to be able to complain about public transportation.
Well, in addition to that, I'll also be complaining about the cold and the snow, because odds are I'm going to be, if I get into any of the schools that are on the top of my list, it will be somewhere where there's a lot of snow. So I'm sure, as someone that's born and raised in California, I will have a lot of complaints about my future home.
I'm sure the first couple of days of snow and public transportation would be like a nice novelty, but then after like the third day, that's when it's going to start hitting you.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's always amazing to me when people from warmer climates want to move somewhere cold, and I understand that oftentimes it's out of necessity for school or work. But as a person who grew up in the cold, nothing on my list that I'm considering is somewhere else that is cold. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm glad everyone's doing
we'll see how that
good.
goes.
And yeah, it'll be exciting to see where we either get to visit Beacon, or hopefully they'll be close enough that we can all be in the same space. I dream of the day where we can all be in the same space. Just there's none of this damn like glitchy internets, and none of this like
Well, I will say that there is one school in Illinois, I think 2 or 3 schools in Indiana, Minneapolis, and Madison. So those are all at least a lot closer to where you are than where I am right now.
Absolutely. So. I'm ready. I'm ready. It's going to be great. Well, there's a lot that happened politically this week, but I think that this week I just wanted to focus on one thing primarily, and that is that we have been 1 year with COVID-19. A lot has happened in the last year. So I put together a little video with a bunch of clips of stuff that has happened every month since last March. And then when we come back, we're just going to talk about everything that really we've experienced with COVID-19 and then where we are today. So we'll be right back after this.
Okay.
WHO has been assessing this outbreak around the clock and we're deeply concerned both by the alarming levels of spread and severity and by the alarming levels of inaction. We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
We do have a sobering guidance, but I think some things are too tough. And if you look at some of the states you just mentioned, it's too tough, not only relative to this, but what they've done in Virginia with respect to the Second Amendment is just a horrible thing. They did a horrible thing to the governor. And he's a governor we worked hard to start off with. So when you see what he said about the Second Amendment, when you see what other states have done, I think I feel very comfortable. Go ahead.
As we come on the air tonight, more than 100,000 lives have been lost to the coronavirus nationwide. 100,000 mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, sons and daughters. 100,000 teachers and nurses, lawyers and bus drivers. 100,000 souls lost not to a war or to terrorism, but to a virus that didn't exist just a few months ago, to an illness that does not discriminate or show mercy. And while the spread of the virus had shown some signs of slowing, tonight there's growing concern that the rate of infections is once again rising in half of U.S. states, just as those states are lifting restrictions.
Milestone today of 200,000 deaths to the virus. What do you want to say to the American people?
Well, I think it's a shame. I think if we didn't do it properly and do it right, you'd have 2.5 million deaths. If you take a look at alternatives, you could have 2.5 million deaths or something thereabouts. You could have a number that would be substantially more.
And good morning, everybody. Welcome to today. It's Friday morning. There is so much going on. It's a lot to wake up to. It's extraordinary. The president and first lady have announced that they have both tested positive for the coronavirus.
In New York, the moment the entire country has been waiting for after a very close race. NBC News now projects that Joe Biden has won the Keystone State, Pennsylvania, and its 20 electoral votes.
And that means we can now project that former Vice President Joe Biden has been elected President of the United States. He is President-elect Joseph Robinette Biden.
CNN now confirms that the FDA has officially given the green light for the emergency use authorization. You'll hear the EUA, that's what it is, for the Pfizer coronavirus vaccine. It's approved.
The nation tonight has marked a new watershed moment in the COVID-19 pandemic. 500,000 confirmed deaths. It comes even as daily increases in infections and deaths have slowed sharply in recent weeks.
I was muted there. So that's just a brief recap. So much more happened during the year since COVID-19 started, and that includes the protests. I don't know why, but the video totally cut the protest scene, and it also lowered Trump's like audio in a lot of them. But I'm okay with that. I'm okay with Trump not being there.
I'm not complaining.
I thought that was intentional, honestly.
But we have arrived at a really grim place. We're at over 500,000 deaths here in the U.S. alone, and there are over there are so many. There's about 2.5 million deaths worldwide. And I think that a lot has happened, but I wanted to just kind of go through talk talking about our experiences from the beginning of COVID-19, I have like really vivid recollections of like remembering back when this began, thinking, oh, we're going to be in this like quarantine phase. It's going to last maybe a few weeks, a month. And here we are a year later with varying restrictions. Of course, we went through the whole election like nonsense and the ups and downs of all of that. We, of course, went through the protests because of the murdering of Black Americans at the hands of police officers all over the U.S. And all the other scandalous shit that has not stopped. Wildfires in California, the deep freeze down in Texas, the snowstorms all over the Northeast, and nothing in our normal life that we'd have experienced has stopped. And on top of that, we are still living through a global pandemic. And so we'll start with you, Vega. Do you recall your first, like, the first thoughts you had around COVID-19 and where you thought we would be versus, you know, where we actually ended up?
Okay. Well, I mean, I'll be honest. When this whole thing first started, I hadn't done too much research about the virus, and so seeing the anti-Asian rhetoric that was coming out of the administration, I kind of took that as a symbol that they were using that to attack the Asian community, and in reality, this thing was no more than an advanced version of the flu. That if we just tackle it properly, we should get in and out no problem. Um, I woefully underestimated both the scope of the virus and the ineptitude that came out of this U.S. government. Like, I'm not like by anything that happened throughout the entire year. I'm not surprised that it's happened, but I definitely was not expecting it to be this brazen. Just the complete lack of sympathy for human life. I think the moment that it hit me that this was going to be much, much bigger and much, much deadlier and much more dangerous. Um, well, two things. The big kind of like news story that broke was some local hospital here in Brooklyn having to shuffle out like you know deceased like deceased bodies by the truckload because it was just spreading and that it was just that deadly. That was like the moment where I was like, oh no, this is going to get much worse because if we're already having to you know deal with the misinformation that was going on and at the time deciding on what the rules of the quarantine was going to look like, um, there was no way that we were going to get out of this um, without this kind of like level of loss. I feel like right around the summer was when and I remember having a conversation with some coworkers. I'm like, I don't think we're getting out of this below 500,000, just at the rate that we're going. And it's unfortunate to have to be right about that because that's still 500,000 lives lost, the majority of which really like could have been prevented. But of course, again, relying on not just the U.S. government, but the U.S. government operating under Trump, operating under the current Republican Party, operating under the current inaction of the Democratic Party. Um, yeah, it's unfortunate to have reached like this milestone. It's unfortunate to have had so many different events, like to go from having the president outright suggesting injecting bleach in order to combat the virus to just being here a year later. Actually, sorry, to go back a little bit because one of the clips that stood out to me from that compilation was that article that talk about how in May that the number was already rising and they were already talking about relieving some of the more like some of the laws about the quarantine, and just kind of like taking back some of the stay-at-home orders and all stuff, and just kind of like mentioning that and having seen that was the conversation back in May. is just ridiculous. Like I I don't I wish there was a way to communicate to people, just kind of like the chain reaction of events that led us to this point, where you can look at something like talking about relieving the stay-at-home orders and then immediately having a spike during that summer. I wish we could kind of like get through to these conservative or the people that tend to vote conservative, and just show them just how these things have got to this point using the words of their own representatives to kind of like highlight, hey, maybe we shouldn't be trusting our lives to people who clearly have no indication that they want to take care of it. Um, but yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this unfortunate milestone. I definitely wish it didn't have to come to this. And that's just not that like not even just focusing on the deaths either, because we still have no true idea of what it looks like for people who have come out of COVID. We're getting reports of like, uh, whatchamacallit, we're getting reports of like long lasting effects, having recovered from COVID, um, and some of which we still haven't discovered. And I think that that's going to be something dangerous, something to that we need to really look at, um, when coming out of this. It's just, it really didn't need to be like this. It really didn't. Um, but it did, I guess, offer a sobering reminder for me, um, just how insidious this government can be. So those are
Yeah,
my initial thoughts on that.
yeah, and for a while, New York was the epicenter of all of the COVID-19, or the highest number of the COVID-19 cases, and it was spreading like wildfire. I remember when I initially I'm a news geek, and so like I literally listened to news all day at work. And I remember when COVID-19 first started, and we were still open because at first it was very slow for any of the local governments to move. California was one of the first that issued a statewide stay-at-home order. Most local governments, along with the federal government, had a really slow response, and so for a while we were still operating. It was a threat, but I remember watching the news coming out of New York and hearing about how crematories couldn't keep up with the bodies, and funeral home phones were just ringing and ringing and ringing, and hearing stories about how people could not be there with their loved ones as they were passing. And I remember being terrified. I'm like, I felt for everyone in New York, because it felt like some scary shit. It felt like some really scary shit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I couldn't even imagine living there. Here in Chicago, when
Yeah,
the orders started, it didn't feel, because our numbers were not as high, it didn't feel like as much as a threat as I was watching on the news about New York.
yeah, and that's the thing too. I think, besides New York being a major kind of like port of entry into this country, so you have, let's be honest, like mostly Europeans that came over, um, that or people being in Europe coming over, and bringing that, and of course them not considering that to be a point of transmission, because they're just focusing on, oh, this is coming from China, so clearly we got to watch out for the Chinese.
Yeah.
But anyways, that combined with the fact that this is such a densely populated city, combined with the fact that, let's be honest, at the beginning, New York did not do well at all in containing this thing. And there's a good chance that we'll be finding out in the next coming months, just how much worse it actually was, considering all the stuff that Cuomo was hiding.
Yeah.
And at least for me, one of the biggest, points of struggle for me, like, so I work at a supermarket, and one of the first things, I'll just say what it is. I work at Trader Joe's, and one of the first things that happened, was when we started getting the information about this virus, we kept kind of like saying, hey, is it all right if we wear gloves? Is it all right if we wear masks? We're kind of being, we're a little concerned about this thing going around. And there was just, and it was not, just the Trader Joe's thing, but I'm just speaking from that particular experience. Like one of the things that kept coming back is like, well, you don't want to scare people, so we're not going to ask you to wear masks or gloves or anything like that. And it really took until the federal government came out and said, hey, or no, sorry, not the federal government, the CDC came out and said, hey, wearing masks actually prevents this. Where companies finally getting the idea like, hey, maybe we should let our employees wear masks and gloves. And in the time that it took to make that decision, that could have easily been done having listened to actual employees. Who knows just how much more transmission was happening during that period of time. And it's things like that that really kind of like stand out to me, because it's a sacrifice that these like the companies and the government are willing to make. It's do we want to inconvenience people, or do we want to look out for their well-being? And time again, states, companies, what have you, kept choosing the not wanting to be inconvenienced part, and have turned it into this whole culture thing that just is frustrating.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. There will be more information that comes out, as it's already apparent that the numbers coming out of New York were underestimated. But also to point out that there have already been studies released that the U.S. federal government, which the Trump administration was consistently trying to undermine and silence the CDC, that their death tolls were also underestimated, and that they were a lot higher in the beginning than we initially thought. And so when we may have reached that 100,000 lives lost death toll mark, it was actually much higher than it already was. And then also to speak to this culture of like not causing panic, it was in March that Trump did tell the reporter, his name is totally skipping my mind right now, even though and I had notes somewhere that I don't know why I put them down. But he told the reporter that he totally knew that this was a big deal and that it was very dangerous, and that he didn't want to cause panic, and he didn't want the American public to worry, so that he was going to like play it down. So yeah, all those things are going to come forward, and it's wild. Like all day I've been looking at everything and several timelines of everything that happened in the last year, and it's been a wild ass year. Beacon, do you remember your first initial thoughts? California, like I said earlier, was one of the first states to issue an entire state stay-at-home order. And I remember also, I think, was it Oakland or San Francisco, one of the two, that were like one of the first cities that issued stay-at-home orders as well. Do you remember your first thoughts around COVID-19 and where you thought we were then versus where we actually ended up now?
I mean, it definitely is a completely different picture a year ago versus now, for a number of reasons. This past weekend a year ago, Duke and I were getting ready to, like, we were starting to pack and get ready for a leather event down in San Diego. And we had to have a conversation about, do we feel like it's safe to actually go? And in the middle of packing, we were like, no, screw it. We're going to just stay home. And then the next day, they ended up canceling San Diego Leather. And then the following week, I had a conference call with all of my colleagues in my division of my company, and we were being told to work from home full time. And I recently looked at that email, a follow up email from my manager, just detailing what our expectations were, blah blah blah, and the details were. And there was just so much optimism that it was only going to be a couple weeks. Like, I remember they explicitly said, yeah, this should just be a few weeks. Don't worry about it. And at the time, I remember, like, there's no way it's just going to be a couple weeks. It's going to be a few months, because at that time, China had already been experiencing and dealing with COVID for a few months. And only at that point were they starting to, quote unquote, get back to normal. And I'm like, okay, so if it took them a couple months, it's going to take us even longer because we're stupid in this country. And that was my first thought. And the first big concern that I had was that the weekend before everything shut down, I went to Disneyland with Duke and my mom. And my mom has a number of health issues that made me very, very concerned and has made me very concerned about her health the past year. And so I was just worried, like, we were there with hundreds of thousands of people. Hopefully she didn't catch anything, and thankfully she didn't. And as of now, she's fully vaccinated. So I'm super thrilled about that. But that was the biggest concern right off the bat. Um, I've been working in the construction industry since um, the entire time that Trump was in office, and for a portion of the election leading up to Trump getting into office. And so I've seen a specific sect of America up close and personal, whether I like it or not, over the past several years. And I knew right off the bat that these people were not going to take it seriously. These people did not care because they there's so many examples in work that just shows that they really do not care about human lives. They don't care about other people. They just care about themselves. Um, and I knew that they weren't going to be consistent with wearing masks. They weren't going to be distancing because, if anything, just from a practical standpoint, a lot of my contractors, their job responsibilities require them to be right up next to each other. So it just was going to be an impractical thing from that standpoint. So from the beginning, I was very concerned that this was going to be bad. And those are people in a quote unquote liberal state like California. Again, heavy quotes on that. But yeah, I don't know. It's what I thought at the beginning is completely different. Like, looking back on it now, there were just certain things that I don't know if I want to say naive about, but just didn't think of how the great lengths that corporations and the government would go to show that they don't actually care about human life. And, for those of us that are not, that are anti-capitalist, we already know that capitalism doesn't really value human life, but seeing it played out in such specific ways over the past year has been incredibly disheartening. The main reason it's been disheartening is that all of America has now seen over the past year how little corporations care about human life. But so much of America is not going to ask for anything different. They're not going to ask for anything to be changed. I mean, one of the big things in the beginning was talking about how if there was universal health coverage, you wouldn't have a lot of people that would be scared or concerned to go to the doctor to get tested and possibly have to be hospitalized, knowing that that was going to be a huge expense for them, to go to ER or whatever. That happened in my own home, that one of my roommates was concerned about that, and all of us in the house reassured him that we'll help out whatever you need. But still, that was a concern over the past year. But there's so many people in the country that are still confident that universal healthcare is this evil socialist thing. And it's like, you saw the past year how this would be beneficial for you, and you still do not want it because that means that other people would get it for free or something. Like, I just don't understand. I mean, I understand, but I just don't understand. And the last thing I'll say is that I got recommended to read a book called Severance by Ling Ma. And it's a book that came out a few years ago, and it depicts the main character going through a pandemic, a global pandemic. It was of a different kind. It still had a infectious component, a high death toll, and all that. Just the results of how the death happened were more zombie-like, but not in like the eating brains zombie. It's a different kind of zombie. But there were, the main character recounts the things that the government was doing through that entire time, and the corporations. But one of the main things is that the government was like, hey, don't make this sound bad. Like, don't release the death tolls. Don't show how bad it actually is, because we want to keep everyone calm. And it's like, I think that if I'd read that book a few years ago, I don't think that I would have expected that would have been what the American government did in reality during COVID, because it just seems so far-fetched. And reading that book now, it's just like, it's like, it doesn't seem as far of a stretch of the imagination for those events in that book to have happened. But anyways, it is, man, things are fucked up with the government, with corporations and capitalism, and it's like if an event, a global pandemic event like this happened and still doesn't change people's minds that change needs to happen, then I don't know what will. I mean, we talked about that when Sandy Hook happened. It's like, oh, surely, strict gun control will happen now. When Sandy Hook happened, no, of course not. Anytime Black men and women and children are murdered, it's like, oh, surely something will happen now. Not a chance. And it definitely remains to be seen about what's going to happen when it comes to what happened with George Floyd. You've got all these different markers, the Parkland high school shooting, all these different things that it's like, surely change will happen now. Surely the government will do something about it. Surely America will elect, better politicians to run this country. And it just doesn't happen. And it just seems like, what more do Americans need to be convinced of change? And I'm really scared to find that out.
Yeah. If I just want to say two quick things. Like, one, to answer that, not to answer the question, but just kind of like going along with that question, I do feel like there are more people who are starting to ask that question to themselves. I just don't know how to kind of like help them get over the hump of, hey, if these things are bad, maybe it's possible to have something new in its place. But obviously that's going to take a little bit more time. And then there's something that you said, I can't remember exactly, but it made me think about how just also this doesn't necessarily help the government or corporations either. Like, if you're looking at it from a purely like, make profit perspective, or purely let's get the most amount of votes, a lot of the things that were done on behalf of those two entities were so counterintuitive. Like, with corporations, pushing to reopen as opposed to pushing for more direct payments so people can actually spend more, as opposed to being in a position now where people have less money to work with on top of having all kinds of debt. So less money is going into the economy, which that's also another thing that I haven't really been able to figure out necessarily, because it doesn't seem like this would be the logical choice for them regardless. It's the same thing kind of like with with a lot of the politicians that have been pushing for the anti-mask position and stuff like that. It would be more advantageous to look out for your constituents' best interest, because if you have less constituents, you have less people that are going to vote for you. But I guess that's the part that I don't like. I don't understand how logically they've been able to come to this conclusion, as opposed to what it is that they're actually doing now, which is somehow depriving people of the very ability to participate in the system you want them to participate in.
I think one of the biggest things that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown is a lot of inadequacies in a lot of different areas of policy, governance, and just the way that we exist as human beings, such as our carbon footprint. The lockdown reduced the carbon footprint of people all over the world, and all over the world you started experiencing these phenomena that you could not experience because of the amount of pollution that we create in the world. Like, the Himalayas were seen from a far distance for the first time in like over 50 years, and just cleaner air. It was just, crazy that you could see that. And I think it's people and advocates, especially environmental advocates, that have been saying these things for years, and the governments all over the world have just not been listening. And just as Beacon mentioned as well, the fact that we don't have universal health care in this country, and how this the health system in the US was not prepared. The federal government was not prepared. They were supposed to have stockpiles of N95 masks and PPE, and they quickly found out that that was not going to happen, and that when they started figuring out that they didn't have enough to distribute all over the country, then they had to figure out where to get it. And where did they turn? They turned to China. One of the biggest places they turned to get PPE was China. And Trump talks shit about China and downplays China and wants to call it the China virus. But one of the places that governments, local governments, and the federal government went to get PPE was China, because it can be mass produced for really cheap there. So I think that there's policy. This brought up really huge inadequacies in policy, whether that be international politics, that be economies, that be trade, that be healthcare, that be human rights, it be environmental rights, all over the place. I think it showcased that there are huge inadequacies in how the world is really managing itself. And that at the end of the day, it ends up impacting the most disproportionate and struggling members of society, no matter where, not just in this country, in other countries as well. And I think that I remember when I first heard about this, because again, I just have the news on constantly. I remember it was a thing. Comic-Con was here in Chicago, and I usually always go to Comic-Con, but I felt really skeptical about being around crowds, and so I didn't go, and I felt anxiety around it. And then right after Comic-Con, that's when everything started to shut down. And I remember my brother manages and owns a business, and so because of that, we get bulletins from the city of Chicago, and one of the bulletins was that the mayor was going to issue a lockdown. And I remember being very panicked, and just everybody was at the grocery store. I remember going to the grocery store, and it was jam packed, and the shelves were bare, and people looked really panicked and really anxious. And then I remember coming and thinking, okay, I got some stuff, I'll be good, it'll be a few weeks. And then when I saw that it was for the long haul, I had to start reducing the amount of news intake that I had every day, because I could literally sit there and watch the news all day. And people are often like, oh, aren't you bored? It's the same thing over and over again. And I'm like, yeah, but I was there's different aspects from different commentators, different anchors, and there's always news happening all over the world. But I really had to reduce the amount of information that I was taking, because I was quickly overwhelming. I started having COVID panic, where I would start experiencing all of the symptoms that they were disclosing as they were disclosing them. I was oh, I have to have hand sanitizer was a whole thing. Hand sanitizer disappeared. Before COVID-19, I was a hand sanitizer freak. I hand sanitize at work. People often want to shake my hand, and right after they shake my hand, I would pump hand sanitizer, clean my hands. And then when hand sanitizer was hard to get, which is a thing that I was always easily available to me, I was oh my God, I don't have one of my safety barriers. One of my safety barriers isn't going to exist. And so I remember though, I was in my mind, although I knew that it was serious, my mind was this is going to be 3 months. It's going to be 3 months and we'll be good. And I think that, I don't know that we could have reduced it to 3 months, but I think that had this country in particular handled things differently, I think had national mask mandates been issued, I think had local governments been reined in, had they not been allowed to reopen, had they had strict enforcement of how we were supporting the healthcare system and getting them the PPE that they needed, while continuing to support scientific and medical communities in all aspects of figuring this out, that we could have reduced the amount of time. But even to this day, it's a year later, and we're still struggling with people that don't want to wear masks, people that don't want to remain socially distant, and people that right now are starting to not want to get vaccinated, and for various reasons. There are people that don't trust the government and the vaccination process. There are people that don't trust the vaccine. Today they released a report where Republicans, 46% said that they would not get vaccinated compared to Democrats. And so there's still a year later, we're still fighting an uphill battle of misinformation, trust and of how it is that we can move forward together so that everyone is safe. And, you know, there are places like Texas. The governor of Texas was like, we're good. Everything's open. Green light. Everyone can be together. We're good. You can wear your masks if you want. And since then, I've seen articles where like gyms are offering mask sections and no mask sections. And I'm like, all of that is visual because it makes no sense whether you're in the mask section or not. The air is still circulating in the same space. And I'm like, oh, at that point, it's just visual. I told Greg that yesterday and he's like, oh, it's like back when they used to offer non-smoking sections and you still left smelling like smoke because it didn't work. It doesn't work. So I think that for me during the first few months, I was like, this is going to be not that long term. It's going to be short term. It's going to be like 3 months. And then when I started reaching the 3-month mark, I was like, oh, okay. Then the panic, I think, became different because I started becoming very concerned for my parents. My parents are in their 70s. They have pre-existing conditions. 3 of my brothers have pre-existing conditions, and they're older as well. And so then it became very much this panic. I remember I was not going into work, and so I would go and get groceries for everybody. Like, I was like, I'm going to be the one that risks it and goes out there. And like, I remember like being the guy that had gloves in the store and had hand sanitizer in my pocket. And I was like hand sanitizing and touching and hand sanitizing and touching and all of those things. And I really didn't think that we would be here a year later, but I think I was naive and I gave people the benefit of the doubt that they would do what they needed to do. And boy, was I wrong. Like, I was absolutely wrong.
I think one of the things that kind of like stood out to me was I didn't realize just how far it would go to make mask wearing seem so controversial, seem like a culture war issue. That's the part that I underestimated. Because I'm just like, okay, it's a no-brainer. You know, it's an airborne virus, put on a mask. I didn't realize that it was going to be turned into something that is so contentious that people are still, to this day, physically fighting for the right to not wear a mask. And, like, in the face of a worldwide pandemic involving an airborne virus. That's the part to me, I think, that I struggled with handling at first because I couldn't conceptualize how that became an issue.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Beacon.
Oh, no, I was going to say that it is I think there's 2 aspects of it. One is that Americans feel like everything has to be politicized. Well, mostly just Republicans have to feel like, oh, other people are wanting to do this. Well, I'm not going to do it because I don't know, whatever. But the other thing is that I think that there is a thing that especially in quote unquote liberal media that they want to legitimize all viewpoints and all opinions. Like, if there's something that it's like, this is either life or death, I don't think that there should be a 2 sides argument to that. That's not an argument. You do the thing that's going to prevent death. Like, you know, and so any amount of time where people were, in, you know, particularly was it New York Times or wherever, any other news outlet that was giving airtime to or legitimizing people that did not want to wear masks because they thought it was like a First Amendment right thing or whatever, that wasn't helping things. That was just making things worse. Yeah. And it's the same thing that, you know, CNN, of course, is the thing that is the news network that everyone makes fun of, that they'll have like their 10-person panels. And because they want to be balanced, they'll have 5 like Marjorie Barrett or Bennett, whatever her last name is, and then, you know, 5 former Democrat politicians. And they think of that as like a, you know, balanced thing. Or it's like they'll have Anthony Fauci being like, no, this is the medical thing that we should be doing. And then 10 people saying, oh, we shouldn't be doing that. Why? Because someone at my gym told me we shouldn't.
Yeah, you have on one end the Anthony Fauci and the other end the Mike Lindell. Like, how is the Mike Lindell My pillow guy having the same amount of say
Yeah.
as a doctor.
Yeah.
Well, people always just want to think that they know more than other people. Like I went down a Twitter rabbit hole today, this morning of like there's always a large amount of you know, person A will say one thing, person B will be like, well, that's not true, and you should get a degree in this before you spout off, in saying that you should be doing this. And then person A is like, well, I literally have a degree, and whatever, thing that you're referencing, I was the one that actually wrote it, so I do know what I'm talking about. And that happens all the time. And usually it's men saying that they know more than women in a particular field. But like that type of thing is our entire lives. That is our entire society of people being like, well, I know more than you. Why do you know more than like why would you think that you know more than infectious disease specialists or public health specialists? Like it's just pisses me off.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing too is that they were emboldened by Trump, right? This is the reason why people in Michigan showed up with guns to the Capitol building and tried to go in, and some did get in and disrupted the legislature. This is why militia groups in Michigan had plotted to kidnapped the Michigan governor. This is why at all these rallies people were maskless and they were contributing to COVID-19 cases and super spreader events all over the country. And he was back then he had access to Twitter and he was spouting his mouth and making posts that were like liberate Minnesota, liberate Michigan, liberate the USA, like we're turning a corner, we're about to get okay, everything's good, like it's almost over, we're doing a great job. I remember one of the biggest things is he would get up there on those daily press briefings and he would pat himself on the back and say what a good job he was doing. What is one of the biggest changes that you all experienced in the last year because of COVID-19? I know for me, and I've talked about this before, one of the biggest things that I have experienced is first of all, I've discovered that I'm an ambivert. And so I appreciate and enjoy time at home doing nothing, not being out and about or socializing. But I think that one of the other things that I definitely experienced is that my lack of faith, or my faith in humanity, has gone down dramatically. I think that I don't know that I had much faith in humanity before, but part of the faith that was left was the faith that thought during a global pandemic people would do what they needed to do to not just survive, but to allow their fellow human beings to survive and come out on the other end of this. And that's gone. Like if we ever experience another global pandemic, like from the forefront, it will be clear to me that it's going to be every person for themselves is a mentality that everyone's going to have. Well, most people are going to have. And then the other thing that I think that was the biggest change for me is approaching the world and how I interact with the world, always with this thought or mentality of like, what is the risk factor in me contracting COVID-19 or being around people that have COVID-19? And so like at work, when I'm there and if a customer comes in and they're paying, like as soon as they leave, like I hand sanitize and I spray down everything on the surface. I spray down the door handles, and like I have this aerosol spray that like sanitizes the air. And like that was one of the biggest changes. Like I was in town visiting, and Greg and he and I were gonna get together, and I dragged my feet for the longest time because I was like, I don't know how to comfortably socialize while it's cold in a way that's gonna feel safe for me and that I'm going to be protecting everybody else that I'm like with. And so we settled on a space where it was just the three of us and we were out in the open. And so we were able to be together and we had our masks and we were able to like sit, and it was fun and we were able to catch up. But one of the biggest changes that I think that I experienced was how I'm viewing the world and how I'm interacting with the world, even with the people that are closest to me and that I love. Vega, how about you? What do you feel like is one of the biggest changes that you've experienced?
I'd have to say, yeah, I had some, like, reflections on, like, whether I was more of an extrovert or an introvert, and, you know, I think, like, I was more of an extrovert, and, you know, I think, like, I was more, like, that didn't really. I don't feel like that was as drastic as of a change, as much as just the idea that trying to honestly, it was trying to find the balance between understanding that these systems and places just absolutely do not care, and how to handle that with trying to navigate the very same things. Like, that was a something that I had to struggle with, especially at the beginning, because my job couldn't shut down because we were essential workers. So every day I had to have the conversation with myself of, is this the day that I'm going to get COVID? Is this the day that someone I find out, someone I know is going to die? Is this the day that I have to get into an argument with somebody who doesn't want to wear a mask? And all those things that I never really had to consider beforehand, coupled with the fact that had I when I brought up any of these, concerns, how immediately you would get shut down, and just kind of like seeing just how quick and easy it is to get people to get discouraged, to the point where, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I think it was more of an existential struggle for me more than anything. Just deciding, like, is this the day that I choose to go into a place that's going to kill me, or am I going to take a day off in order to preserve my health? And I think over time, for better or for worse, I've gotten better at making choices that prioritize my health above anything. Because at the end of the day, if I die, these bills are not getting paid. So what does it matter?
Yeah. And I think there were a lot of people that were in that boat with you, Vega, because I think that one of the things that I do remember at the beginning of the pandemic was that all of a sudden, all of these people got labeled as first responders. But the people that were getting the primary media attention and I guess the benefits of being labeled as the first responders were like nurses and doctors and hospital staff. And although, yes, absolutely, thank them for like doing the work that was very hard to do, there were other people that got labeled as first responders that had to go out there every day to risk their lives. And those were restaurant employees. Those were delivery drivers. Those were taxi drivers, Uber drivers, factory folks. The meat industry, in order to continue having this country running, had continued to run and operate. And a lot of those factories were not adhering to guidelines and had huge outbreaks. Farm workers, people that were picking fruit, mostly immigrants that were getting paid super low wages already, that maybe got $1 raise, were out there picking fruit to ensure that the country had food. And so there are janitors that were cleaning and sanitizing, garbage workers that were picking up trash. There are so many people that got labeled first responders and got a little bit of a bump, but they didn't get the real recognition that they deserve. I remember like Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks would have like, free coffee day for like nurses and doctors. And I'm like, well, there are a lot of other people that are going to work every day that probably don't want to be there, that are probably struggling, that are probably experiencing high levels of stress and dealing with like really crazy situations that could probably use a cup of joe in the morning. But a lot of the accolades and attention went to like medical providers. I remember here in Chicago, they started doing the like sing along, and every night at 7 they would like go out onto their balconies and turn on lights, and it became this whole big fucking ordeal where like DJs were like on rooftops playing music, and every night everybody would like sing along and like thank the first responders. But again, that primary attention was like to healthcare workers. And again, although yes, thank you so much for doing that hard work, there were so many other people that were getting screwed and that were being exposed to like really high risk situations. So I think it was
But
really
even then,
shitty all around.
even then there was like specific choices about who was like you're suggesting. There were specific choices about who was being labeled as essential first responders, who was deserving of praise and stuff like that. Like I definitely know for a fact that had nurses not been so much more heavily involved directly with dealing with patients as opposed to the doctors themselves, I'm pretty sure they would have been left out of those like thank yous as well. It would have just been, oh well,
Yeah.
thank the doctors.
Absolutely.
I think people only wanted to choose the capacity in which they wanted to care for the people that were taking care of them.
Yeah.
And that shows also in the way that kind of like companies treated us, and also with the government. Like there was really like, for all the talk of first responders and all this stuff, there was very very little done to not only care for the people who were essential workers and first responders, but also just in general, like once people just felt like tired of doing their 8 o'clock sing-alongs or 7 o'clock sing-alongs, which happened here and was super annoying. It's funny, like every healthcare worker that I personally know was just like, I hate it, I wish they would stop. But like once they got tired of it, it stopped. So like then the essential workers are still working. This thing is still going on.
Yeah.
So where's all that love go? Like I guess there's a limit to which people were willing to care about that kind of thing. And then after that, everyone was just kind of left to the dust.
Yeah. I'll tell you what's interesting is here in Chicago, they stopped, but they only stopped because of the George Floyd protests. And even then, because they like had a whole Facebook group here in Chicago where like you could join and they picked the song so that everybody was like in queue and in sync. And when like people went to the group and was like, we should not be out there singing on our balconies because there are people out on the streets like calling for justice because Black lives are being murdered by police officers. There were threads upon threads upon threads of people that were like, oh, we should still be thanking the first responders and the doctors and the nurses. And like, it can be a call for unity while we're like thanking the first responders. And I just remember thinking like, first of all, I like removed myself from the group. I had only joined it because I was like, what is all this noise happening at 7 o'clock every day? But then I saw that and I was like, well, quickly I removed myself from the group. But then I was like, this is like the caliber of people that still exist in the world. They couldn't even like in their minds grasp the thought that it would be completely out of line to be singing on their balconies to some song while people are out on the streets like calling for justice. And it was just baffling.
Wasn't there that one photo, I want to say it might have been in New York, but there was a march that was happening of BLM protesters and there were people seated at an outdoor dining area that were kind of just like, what's this shit going on behind me? And it was wild. And of course, everyone that was, at the restaurant were white. And just seeing that, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That you're only focusing on certain aspects. And a huge part of like, praising the first responders or, encouraging people to mask or whatever was just so that they could go back to brunch. I mean, it's the same thing as like, let's get Trump out of office so he can go back to brunch and stop thinking about politics on the weekends, stuff like that. But I think that there was a few aspects of how America felt about essential workers. There was definitely the aspect of, as you said, caring and paying attention and drawing attention to the flashier ones, which no knock on nurses and doctors, absolutely, because they've had a lot of shit to deal with in the past year, a lot of traumatic shit to deal with. But, to your point, people that work at grocery stores, people that work in retail, literally had people physically fighting them over wearing a mask, right? So there also are other aspects of essential workers that were in, literally in physical danger. And it just shows that there's only certain groups of people in America that Americans actually care about. Working in construction, there's one of the big job sites that I deal with a lot. I get for a long stretch of time, I was getting near daily emails with the positive case count on that particular job. That job only shut down once, and that was because it was the day before Thanksgiving. But you had every day, nearly every day, you were getting multiple positive cases. And it was just like, fuck it, let's just keep going. It's like, what? Why? Why
Yeah.
are we doing this? The second point is that here in California, we showed that we don't actually care about essential workers so much that when it was election day, they voted, or Californians voted to strip protections away from Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, and all the food delivery drivers.
Yeah.
Like that was really sending a message of how little a lot of Californians actually cared about essential workers. Like that was an opportunity at the ballot box to say we care about essential workers and we want to protect them and we want to make sure that their wages are protected and et cetera. And Californians were like, nah, we're good. And then immediately after that, you heard reports of drivers getting fired and union drivers and particularly union workers getting fired, and wages going down and extra fees getting tacked on and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then the third thing is just the debates that have been happening over the past year about stimulus checks, right? This is only the third stimulus check in the past year, and it totals what, $3,200 between all three, right? I think the first one was 1,200, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep. 12, 6, and 14.
It's like I don't want to do the math because I can't do the math, but just $3,200 over the course of 12 months. The fuck? And like, it was a fucking struggle. And it didn't, of course, it didn't have to be. We can, bash on Democrats a little bit later if we want to, but of course they were debating against themselves. But like, it should be easy to just be like, we want to keep all of the residents that didn't die, all the minus the 500,000 people that did die in America. We want to keep everyone else safe, and we want to keep everyone else healthy and be able to provide them means to stay healthy and alive. And even that was up for debate. Like, what are we doing here? And it's just one of those things that it just reveals the depths of cruelty and the lengths that people will go to show their cruelty in this country.
Yeah. It comes out to $66 a week. That's what the U.S. government has given, $266 a month for folks to survive during a global pandemic when the economy is tanking, unemployment is at its highest it's ever been, and we've lost over 500,000 lives in this country alone. Beacon, what is the biggest change that you've experienced?
Well, I mean, the last point, apart from showing the depths that people will go to just show that they don't care, I've kind of become the de facto like hall police, or I don't know what that actual term is because I was homeschooled. Sorry, hall monitor. I've been the hall monitor of my work in terms of like making sure that everyone wears masks. Like my manager insists on having in-person weekly meetings, and he doesn't wear his mask half the time. And I keep on having to be like, dude, like I don't want to come here if you're not going to wear your mask. And that's always a hard thing to like tell your manager you don't want to do something. But the other thing is, I mean, I think to Freddie's point, it's just it has shown how much I enjoy just being at home. And in the conversations that I've had with Duke over the years, I've been afraid of domesticity. And we've had a lot of that the past year, and it's actually been okay. But also just how little I need to actually talk to people and how few people I do need to talk to. For the three of us who've been active at different times in the leather community and other community social circles, there is a lot of when you're at events, you're having to, talk to people. You go to these different social events, you go to bars, you go to events, contests, blah, blah, blah. And when you're at those places, there's a lot more people that you might talk to at that particular location than you would during the week. It's the bar friends, right? Versus, drinking buddies versus actual friends. And seeing the reduced number of people that I actually talk to on a regular basis throughout the week, it has been very interesting. And I was talking to Duke, my fiance, about it the other night, just about what community is going to look like after this and what I am going to want to prioritize and pursue, and not just people, but also places and institutions that I want to invest my time and energy into. Um, and the other aspect of it has been, planning our wedding next year of like, oh, I don't actually need these people to be invited to my wedding, right? Like, I don't actually like, it's been an interesting parallel example um, of the past year of like who actually I want in my life. And so that's been the biggest thing. And I'm very curious about the first time that I go to a bar or an event after all this is quote unquote more open, and who I'm actually going to talk to or and who I'm not going to talk to. Like, and I've had this thought of there are people that I used to be um, familiar with or be sociable with, but not actually, I don't actually want to be friends with them. It's just like, oh, hi, how's it going? Say hi, blah, blah, blah. I don't need to actually do that anymore because why am I going to go through those exercises? But there's also a part of me that wonders, having been starved for human touch and human connection over the past year, would there be some people that I'd be willing to just like embrace and just hug and just connect with for the sake of connection, right? Rather than that particular person specifically. And that's the thing that I have been thinking about a lot over the past year. And, I'm very curious to see how it actually plays out because I think that, I don't know about y'all, but, I miss hugging people. I miss, kissing people. I miss just feeling someone else's embrace, apart from the roommates that I have here. But like, I haven't hugged my mom in 4, 5 months. And like, I miss that. Right. Um, and so I'm very curious about once I get into socializing, how that's actually going to play out. And sorry, I kind of rambled a bit, but I guess just getting in my
No.
feelings a little bit. So.
I think that's totally fair. I also think that it's important that we know that, or that we're starting to have the conversations or be present to the fact that whatever the end result is, however we come out at the other end of this, things are not going to be the same and they're going to be very different. For a lot of the reasons that Beacon just mentioned, they said that they have been like craving this sense of touch and like socializing and affection and connection. And for other people that like have lost that sense of connection and socializing, I know myself for a fact, I'm like, I want to keep my circle close and small the way I always have. There will always be people, and like people always gravitate to me. I don't know what it is that makes people gravitate to me. It's probably because I'm loud and I'm always laughing a lot. But people gravitate to me, and then I know that there will always be people on the outside of the circle. But I want to keep my circle close. I want to keep them small. And I know that those are the people that I want to devote my time and energy to. And then throughout this pandemic, there are people where I'm like, I'm okay if I never see you again because you've shown yourself to be garbage. There are other people that I'm like, oh, I don't know that you were as important in my life as I may have thought that you were. And then there are other people where I'm like, you were just a passerby that was not really on the train that's going to the end, and so I think things are going to change. I think they're going to be really different, and we're going to have to figure that out as it comes. I don't know that I can say what that's going to look like now because, who knows? I say this now, and then like when we get the all clear and the green light, I'm going to be the first one at the bar twirling around.
Honestly, I've had the same thought. Just because I it's not very often that I'm able to go to like these events and feel like fully comfortable. Like there's always like people that I'm trying to avoid because I know things about them and I'd rather not interact with them, or there's other people that I'm just like, I know your politics are trash, so I don't want to see you in person, or I didn't want to think about sleeping with you or anything like that. But at the same time, it's the starvation has gotten to a point where like I can't say for certain that I'm not entering the next event like knees first. Like this is it's it's gonna be interesting to see. But I will say that I am going to be going into it looking at certain people differently, just because and I just made a post about this recently. Like I noticed that there was a lot going on, in terms of like the leather community, and part of me wanted to know what was happening because I'm nosy. But I think throughout this last year, I've learned to truly like value peace, like value like I don't really need to know about this. I know there's certain people that are trash. I know that like, you know, it's going to be a debate as to whether or not this person should like these particular people should have power or anything like that. And all those conversations that I'm just like, I've already made up my mind about this. I don't see how it's a debate, and I don't know if I want to be around people that want to debate this. So it's gonna be interesting, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that one of the most important things that I have come out of this year too is that Vega, and I'm really thankful that you pointed that out. I have come to a point where now I will make my own determinations about who I give my time to, who I allow to be in my space. And that can be, and not just physical space. Like if you're taking up space on my timeline and I know you to be trash, I've seen you to be trash, I don't have to give you a second chance. I don't have to be part of the transformative like process that you're going through to arrive at the other end a better person. Good for you if you do that. Continue being a shitty person if you continue being a shitty person. But I can make the determination that I don't want you in my space or in my life or taking up my energy or taking up my time. And that is everywhere. It can be a post on Facebook that I don't need to be seen. And just like you, I saw a bunch of blurbs and I too was like, I want to be nosy. And then I also thought to myself, I have probably made the right moves because I don't openly know about this trash that is happening. And that probably has brought me a lot of sanctity and peace. And that doesn't just go for the leather community, it goes for anything, I have gone through and deleted a bunch of people on all of my social media profiles. I use my social media profiles for very specific things. And when I feel like it's overwhelming me, I put my phone down. I watch Star Trek. I just binge watch Veep in like a whole week, and like I'll do things.
I'm watching Veep right now.
Yeah,
too.
Veep was good. It was really good the second time around. It also had really crazy jokes that I don't remember from the first time. I rewatched The West Wing. There are plenty of things that I can do to consume my time that make me feel good and make me feel positive and that allow me to take care of myself without being sucked into drama, right? Because then you feel like you have to make a post to denounce something or someone, or you feel like you have to like step in to support or protect someone, and like we don't have time for that. Not in 2021, when we're dealing with a global pandemic, when we're trying to take care of ourselves the best way possible, when we've been isolated from a lot of the support networks that we have. And so I think I'm with you. I'm in the same place where I am thankful that I have given myself that peace, because it feels good. It feels good to not have to jump out and be like, oh fuck, like this person posted some crazy fucking shit again.
Yeah. And real quick about that too.
Sorry,
like even just the fact that I am not friends with the specific person or friends with the people that are supporting these people, the fact that I don't have to say anything at all because my disconnection is already proof of my position. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've been like just talking about COVID, not to mention, of course, it's been a year since Breonna Taylor's murder, and George Floyd, his anniversary is going to come up pretty soon. sooner than we realize. And in general, seeing, again, being reminded of how little so many Americans care about Black lives, but also specifically in the communities that we're talking about, in the leather community and whatnot, that like in the past year has been very revealing of, oh, okay, so once again, you're showing, who you are. And it's less so the individual who's being extremely racist. That part, it's like, it's in a way expected, especially what we've seen in the community. Like, but how many people are willing to defend people? And how many people are quote unquote allies that they claim that ally card and they eat all the cookies and still are, supporting a particular person, right? And I've talked to you both about, one person in particular who's been historically transphobic and racist, and so many people are like, yeah, we're cool with it. It's fine. We're okay. Recently, I saw that there's this one guy. Right. And that's what they've been saying over the past 5 years. There's this other guy that's in Florida, and he has like on his chest a very visible tattoo of an alt-right neo-Nazi organization. And it's very visible. And he's shirtless in his photos a lot. And he's shirtless in his photos a lot with a lot of quote unquote prominent people in the community. And it's like, I'll admit, I didn't immediately know that that was a neo-Nazi group. I had to look it up. But once you do know, why are you like, wouldn't you even just be like, please take the photo down?
Yeah.
Please take the photo down because I do not want myself on your page.
Yeah.
And again, it's one of the things that I did the end of last summer, I backed away from engaging with Facebook as much as I used to. Like, it used to be like a daily thing where I check Facebook and all that, and I just have backed away considerably. I've had it off my phone for long stretches of time, and it's nice to not know what's going on. It's nice to, to your point about, wait, do I want to know what this drama is? Do I want to know who this person is? Do I want to know if I'm connected? Whatever. It's just nice to be unaware of all that shit that's going on.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good segue, because that brings us into, I think, one of the hardest things that happened during the global pandemic was, what a lot of media or like folks are labeling as like this reckoning that the U.S. has come with, like racial tension and racial injustice. But really, it's what's been happening in this country since its inception, and ever since like the people that came here and took land and killed people here on this land were doing in their previous countries. But the George Floyd murders, Breonna Taylor's murder, there were so many incidents and instances of murder at the hands of police officers towards Black folks here in the U.S., and that sparked huge movements that spanned all over the world. I want to talk about this because I think that it impacted me in this really specific way, because I knew from the onset of COVID-19, and when I saw that it was getting serious, I knew that I couldn't expose myself, and I had to do everything I could to protect myself and to protect those that I loved. And when the protests happened for social justice, for police officers murdering Black folks, it was really hard, because I live in the Loop, and so literally the protests were like all around me. Helicopters were up overnight. The protest groups were passing by, and I knew that these people had made the calculated risk to participate and were doing everything they could to stay as safe as possible while calling for social justice. And so I found other ways to support. I got trained in how to be a street medic towards the end, because I'd gotten to the point where I'm like, I'm going to go out there and if I'm needed. I started supporting by doing social media campaigns for different groups and prepping flyers. I started supporting by dropping off bottles of water to groups that were out there every day so that they had hydration. But one of the things that I think was hard to watch was that all of this was happening during a global pandemic when the communities that the police are murdering are already experiencing loss of life because of the disparity blah 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 words because of the disproportionate ways in which COVID-19 was impacting communities of color. And so I want to talk about the civil unrest that did happen all over the country, that was sparked by George Floyd, but there was many murders at the hands of police officers that happened in that time, and there have been many that have happened before. And this is also not the first time that police agencies or entities or government agencies have targeted black folks in particular. There have been civil rights leaders that the U.S. government has targeted to defame and to murder. I recently saw the Fred Hampton movie, Judas Black Messiah, I think is the title, and like the movie was good, but that prompted me to go and do a bunch of research into Fred Hampton, and like there was a whole counterintelligence program that the FBI had, that included targeting Fred Hampton, a lot of Black Panther leaders, Martin Luther King. The federal government was trying to like ruin his marriage and targeting him. And there are so many different ways in which this has existed and has been happening in this country for so long. But right in the middle of it, I think there was a powder keg that was happening. And I think because injustice has been happening for so long, but I also think that COVID-19 had people in lockdown. They were at home. There was a lot of energy there that I think gave them the energy to propel them to go out and call for justice in such a big ways. And all of that also happened in really crazy ways. Here in Chicago, I can speak to it. The mayor, when the protests went downtown and they started breaking into businesses in the downtown area, and the comfortable folks that live in the very affluent area of Chicago were experiencing this on a daily basis. She called for the National Guard, and they created a police militarized zone around the downtown area, and you couldn't get in without your ID that proved that you lived there or that you had a business that you owned, that you were going to there. And so like literally, if I went anywhere like that was outside of my neighborhood to get groceries, to run an errand, I had to go through a military checkpoint to get back in. And so like the way all of that was handled was really shitty. And like even now, it has been disclosed that Mayor Lightfoot used the federal aid for COVID-19. A majority of it she used to pay police officers overtime during that time. And so those are the ways in which the government and government entities have continued to fuck over folks and communities of color. But I want to ask you all what your experiences were during all of the civil unrest that was happening. And like, where did you all land while you were experiencing it, but also having to be present that, as many people were, that you had to do all of this during a global pandemic, and it had to be very tricky how you navigated and how you quarantined yourself and how you like protected yourself and protected those that you loved while you were out there, calling for justice for the folks that were being murdered at the hands of police officers. Vega, do you want to start?
Yeah. I think the concern of COVID transmission, for me at least, wasn't really at the forefront, just because of the moment that was happening, but also because for as many years as I've been, going to actions and rallies and stuff like that, it was always my experience that the people's health would always be taken care of first. And that became true too, that like the majority of the people actually, I can't really think of a person that contracted COVID shortly or anytime after going to a rally. So that was never of concern to me. It was unfortunate, but like I knew that like at the very least, like safety was going to be a priority, as it always is, especially amongst like community organized events. Um, it I got overwhelmed this year more so than any other year. Not because, mostly because part of it is, exhaustion. Because I've been trying to deal with I guess, how do I want to say it? Like, I've been trying to kind of like manage my ability to be present at a lot of these events, because I felt as the years went on that it became more and more difficult for me, just physically, mentally, emotionally, to be there. So I've always been trying to look at different ways that I could support. Actually, it's funny that you mentioned that towards the end you were training to be a street medic, because that's actually something that I've been looking into as well. Because I feel like I want to find ways to participate within my current capacity now. When I was younger, it was a lot easier for me to just get up and go to a rally for 12 hours, um, and like march for miles and stuff like that. Nowadays, it's not so realistic. So that, strangely enough, took an emotional toll on me, because my heart wanted to be there all the time. My heart wanted to be just around people, like fighting for the same thing, and just kind of like help, like educating each other, because a lot of these events used to be very educational for me too, because you'd have people speaking on specific or very specific kind of like angles by which all this violence is taking place, and helping people understand it, and et cetera, et cetera. um and then the other thing that got really exhausting for me, that I chose to kind of like step back a little bit more from this, um was just how exhausting the performative allyship was this time around. Because, like, before, back in 2014 with the Mike Brown protests and stuff like that, um, you'd be hard pressed to find a single kind of politician or even organization or corporation um, say anything just even along the lines of Black Lives Matter. Whereas this year, it just was relentless how all of them just kept saying it, when we know that they truly don't believe it, and they're not doing anything to support it. You had the picture of Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer fucking kneeling in the Capitol. That picture both makes
Fucking
me laugh
idiots.
and just infuriates me so much. Um, because now we've gotten to a point where the illusion of being an active participant to the cause has become so, I don't know, enveloping, overwhelming. It's been a lot to deal with, because it's like I don't know how many more times I can say that this shit is fake, and you're not like, and they're not actually doing anything. Like, they're not going to be the ones out here providing water for the people that are marching. They're not going to be the ones out here advocating, um, for defunding the police. In fact, like, even the phrase defunding the police was considered to be so controversial, that every politician in government, local government, has been funneling more money to the police, which is just like, that's literally the opposite of what we're asking for, and clearly against the very thing that you say you're for. So I guess the performance more than anything was the thing that was just most infuriating for me. Like, they had all the people that were putting Black Lives Matter on their profile pictures and Twitter bios, and I don't remember where I saw this meme, but it was basically like, you know, I wonder how, like, the performative allies are feeling right now, like trying to decide how soon is it too soon to take down their BLM for their bio, and that's essentially what it is. It just feels like such a performance, and it's exhausting. I had to explain to people just how performative this all is, and how counterproductive it is. So basically make something like Black Lives Matter, that started as a hashtag for awareness, into a brand, where at the end of the day, you're not actually helping Black lives. So it's just that disconnect has become wider for me, and it's become more difficult for me to navigate silently, um, in order to function in this society. I think that it's become very hard. Whereas before, um, because I was working under the assumption that most of these companies don't give a shit, and they can't even say Black Lives Matter. For To go from that and being aware that, like, these companies aren't going to care, to now having seen them pretending to care, knowing that they're undermining it in every single possible way, and then explaining that to people and helping them understand that, no, Warner Brothers putting up a hashtag at the end credits of one of their films um, does nothing for the Black community. And that's essentially, like, I think the back and forth of that has truly been exhausting, and I've had to take a step back from that, because especially now, I've been wanting to focus more on actually educating myself on alternatives that are possible. um in particular, as something that I never thought I'd find myself now gravitating towards is, Black anarchism, and kind of like learning more and more and more about that, um, has been much more fulfilling for me, um, than trying to keep up with the performances, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Beacon, how are you? How about you?
Yeah, it's been an interesting year with that. And, going back to the beginning in terms of the protests, there was, there definitely was a certain amount of risk assessment for me from a few different angles. The COVID angle was really not like the highest risk. For me, the highest risk was more that uh, being Black and being visibly presumed as a Black man, that I would be um, singled out and targeted by cops when they were retaliating against protesters. And there was just that reality of, do I want to um, put myself at risk in that point? And I had to work through a lot of realizing that there are more ways than just being on the front lines of a march, to be able to protest and to be able to support, whether it's being trained in medical support like you, Freddie, or even donating funds, donating goods to folks that were protesting. Like, there are other ways, and I had to find those other ways for myself, because I was very much concerned. Um, and it's not that in previous BLM protests that there haven't been violent retaliation, but it seemed in a certain way that it was a little bit more heightened this year, this past year with the protests, and it definitely did freak me out and concern me. So that was a huge internal process that I had. Um, was figuring out my role and what I could contribute and what I had the capacity to contribute and the spoons to contribute. Um, in terms of since then, seeing how BLM on profiles, social media profiles, is very much it. And I don't want to say this, but it is in a way a trend that a lot of people are like buying into, and a lot of white people are buying into, like, ooh, I want to do this so I can look cool, or that they will use it as a shield to shield themselves from any criticism moving forward. Being like, well, I have BLM in my profile, so obviously I'm not racist, or whatever. She was like, how could I possibly be racist? And it's like, girl, you're an old 60s white woman from England. Like, yeah, there's definitely a high possibility that you're racist. Like, I'm sorry, but yeah. Um, and the other day I saw on Twitter, my porn Twitter, a couple of people were sharing this photo of a quote unquote hot cop. And of course, the people that were sharing it had BLM in their profiles. It's like, okay, so you're not really on board with anything or with any significant change for that matter. Um, but yeah, it is. I'm glad that there have been various conversations about Black Lives Matter and about funding the police, abolishing the police, and whatnot. And I'm hoping that eventually this country gets to the point collectively where we are at an equitable point for Black people all across the country. It's not going to be anytime soon. And that's not me. I'm not saying that as a like, oh, we need to, take small steps to, make progress. It's just more reality of I look at the country and I know it's not going to happen anytime soon. Democrats is explicitly elected a president that said he wanted to fund the police even more. Like that was the president that they elected, and the vice president is, in her words, the top cop, former top cop of California. That's who Democrats elected. And so it's just the reality of things in terms of looking at the next several years of American life and American politics. It's going to be a while. Um, I'm not giving up on wanting that to happen, of course, but it does make me a little bit pessimistic, of course. And to your Freddie brought up the Judas and the Black Messiah. I watched that last night with Duke, and it had been something that I've been thinking about for a while, and it comes up pretty regularly about the um, concept of Black capitalism or POC capitalism or minority capitalism or whatever, of like the way that we lift up the communities is by Black capitalism. Specifically talking about Black people right now. That's not the answer. That's not actually doing anything. That's not actually changing the system. Um, it just means that you might have a couple more Black people on Forbes' richest Americans list. But that's not actually changing the community. That's not changing the conditions for the community. That is not actually addressing the explicit needs of the community. Having more rich Black people does not actually serve all Black people. And especially when you look at oftentimes rich Black people or rich minorities end up being Republicans, anyways. So they are explicitly against marginalized communities and the communities that they are a part of. And so I think that I know obviously us marginalized folks are having these conversations about what we need as a community and what we need to move forward. I just hope that white Americans do more than just put BLM in their social media profiles, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And the reality is that we are the minority in this country, and historically the minority doesn't get to legislate for themselves. Like we do need the majority to actually um, think of someone other than themselves and of their own social group and their own social status or economic status, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that they get on board. Again, I'm not expecting anything anytime soon, but like, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's just how much more does this country have to experience? How much more do marginalized folks have to endure? How much more death? How much more suffering, physically, emotionally, whatever, do we have to experience before this country changes direction in any number of ways? And again, what I said earlier is I'm very afraid to see what it takes to see change happen.
Yeah. And
just to add to that, it's the difficulty of getting people to get to the point where their participation goes beyond what they're comfortable with. Like, with the conversation, for example, of like defund the police and abolish the police, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, already, like, that was already a compromise. But the fact that, like, we,
Right.
as a society, because most, I actually wouldn't even say that, like, because it is still a point of contention amongst marginalized community as well. The idea of being able to imagine what a country could look like without the police. Like, we're not even at that point of the conversation just yet. We're still debating on what words to use in the sentence. And I think that's the uphill battle that we have. Imagining a world where marginalized people do not have to get prosecuted, and are not, like, receiving the short end of the stick as it comes to, like, needs and privileges. I think, for me, like, we won't be able to start to move forward until we can get to a point where we can imagine that we can exist without these very systems that suppress us.
Yeah. Well, I think what's important is in all of those things is that these conversations continue to happen, right? And so I think that one of the things for me that happened in conversations just with you, Vega, is that I went from this like defund the police mentality, and like it was very easy for me as soon as I heard it. I was like, absolutely, it makes sense to like abolish the police, right? And like it's crazy because like in my mind, like that wasn't even one of the options. My option that like made sense was like, yes, absolutely, we should defund them and give money to like places that are actually going to do work that's going to support the community. And like in my mind, I don't know if it was because I've been so programmed and conditioned to think that like the police will always exist, that one of the options wasn't even like get rid of them altogether. But from the conversations that I had with you and like being led in those conversations, I'm like, absolutely, like abolish the police, abolish the military state. Down with J-Lo, down with Christmas. And so I think that it's important for folks to hear from other folks that look like them or share their values, so that we can continue to hold those conversations as hard as they may be, because you're absolutely right. There are a lot of communities of color that are not comfortable with defund, abolish, and that language still scares them. And it's because of programming and conditioning. So
that, and then also, just real quick, like, just because it kind of goes back to what you were saying about, Black capitalism, where, the solution is being presented to us as within the very system that has put us in this position in the first place. So, like, the idea that Black capitalism could be the thing that we need in order to get out of the place where the police are killing Black people, it's like, these things don't match up. In fact, one of these things is only supported because of this. Capitalism in general can only exist because the cops are the ones that are doing the enforcing. So it's being able to see outside of that. And like, just real quick, out of like, for personal experience, it's something that I always struggled with growing up. Being in like a marginalized community, being in a community that's poor, being surrounded by like people of color, being a person of color, being a family of color. We had so many situations, living in an area where, our safety was in jeopardy, whether it be outside the home or inside the home. And every time we had to continuously have the debate of, do we call the cops and believe that they can help us out of the situation? Or are they going to come in here and make things 1,000 times worse? And the fact that as a 6-year-old, I had to have that conversation with myself and with my sisters, that's not, like, I don't see how anything about that thought process can and should be okay. And the fact that, like, this conversation is happening many, many, many times a day in many different households, it speaks to there being a sort of deficiency that needs to be addressed. And yet, at no point, like you were saying, at no point is the topic of, let's remove this situation altogether and figure out what else can we do in which people's needs are being met first, as opposed to enforcement of laws created to uphold a system that only works for a few people. Like, it's just, it's important to start finding ways to introduce people to the idea that we don't need this to keep happening. Not to say that like the fault lies in us, but we have the answer.
Yeah.
Like the people that have been marginalized, we have the answer on how to solve this shit. It's only a matter of when are you going to actually listen to us, and when is our needs and lives going to be prioritized.
Yeah, and I think that, we should continue to have the conversations in which we can reduce the different footprints that we have every day. Carbon, capitalistic, all of the footprints that we have. And so I'm appreciative that am able to experience those conversations right here while having some fun. So where are we a year later? There's over 500,000 deaths. There's 2 vaccines here in the US. There's a few globally that are being used outside of Pfizer and Moderna. But there are also new variants of COVID-19 that are 3. There's 3 vaccines.
J&J.
J&J. Oh yes, I forgot about Johnson & Johnson. I totally forgot about it. There's 3 here in the US.
Much less effective, so I don't know.
It has a much lower efficacy rate. So it's 3: Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. And then in other parts of the world, there's the AstraZeneca. So they're out there, but there are new COVID-19 variants that are shown to have resistance to the vaccination process. And there have been some studies, because now they're starting to have data from folks that are vaccinated that are showing that there have been some folks that can get COVID-19 even after vaccination. It's a small 5% chance, but those folks that did get it, the good news that came from that is that they got a less severe version of COVID-19. So I'd like to think that we're excuse me. I'd like to think that we're in like a smidge of a better place because of vaccination. Testing has gotten better. It's still chaotic. It's still a mess. And the vaccination process to sign up this is the worst rollout I think I've ever experienced of anything in my life. But we're here, and I'm happy that both of you are here. I'm happy that Greg is here. I'm happy that we continue to hold these conversations. And as I promised, I want to end PogoPog on lighter notes, especially after COVID-19. A heavy, full hour and a half of COVID-19. I wanted to end on the light note of, if you had a superpower, what would it be and why? And I will model. I'm going to go back to my education days. I'm going to model. And the superpower that I want is I want the ability to be immortal. And I've had this conversation many times with people, because people are like, you're going to outlive everyone that you love, and you'll have to like develop new friends, and you'll have to like be heartbroken forever in infinity. But I don't want to die, and I want to experience the Star Trek world I was promised as a child. I want to be in space. I want to be on a spaceship. As a child, I'm a history nerd as well. All things about history really excite me and get me going. And I have always dreamt of like what it would be like to walk in like the pyramids with the Aztecs, and like what it would be like to be there when the crazy ass founding fathers of this country were like putting the Constitution together, and what their real drunken like thoughts were. And like I would like kill to be like there when like Caesar was murdered, and like see if he actually, it's always like et tu Brutus. Like all of those things excite me, and so I want to be immortal so I can experience everything. And someone could be like, what was it like when you were on lockdown for a year for COVID-19? And I could be like, oh, I was there 4,000 years ago, and I can tell you. I'm pretty sure that like when I'm like I've been around for 4,000 years, I'll probably be over it by then. But that's my superpower. If I could have one, it would be to be immortal. Who wants to go first? I won't pick anyone. I'll let you all self go popcorn style.
Oh, I've always wanted to be able to fly. Like, looking at Storm or, other mutants that have the ability to fly, I've always wanted to do that. And anytime that I dream and I'm able to fly in my about the, experiencing, if I was able to fly and also be able to survive in space, so that I can actually be able to, experience what space is like, that would be the best.
That would be
Literally the best of
freaking
both
cool.
worlds. So, yeah.
Listen, in 1,000 years, if I ever am granted my immortality, I'll bring like a little capsule of you with me, so that you can experience space with me when I'm up there on the Star Trek ship. I was promised. Damn you! I'm gonna be on a bridge of a starship. I'm telling you right now, and I'm gonna be like engaged. Like I want that to be a real thing that happens. I doubt it will, but I could dream, right? Vega, how about you?
I've actually, like something that's been recurring thought, because I actually just have been binging Next Generation as well. My big thought has been my recurring thought has been, like if I look at something that's not necessarily progressing us forward, it's this is not how we're going to reach our Star Trek future. So
absolutely.
But the power, like flying, has always been at the top of my list. But something that I've been kind of like more, I guess, if I were to have a more specific power, I would love the ability to manipulate pressure. Because I feel like it opens you up to so many different kinds of abilities.
I bet it does.
Like, I wasn't even.
I couldn't resist. The door was open and I had to walk through.
I mean, you know what? Yes, it would apply in a lot of different ways. I thought about, like, for example, like trying to go like deep underwater or go into space, even that a lot of the issue tends to be around just, not having the components to breathe, but then also the immense amount of pressure that, people are under. So being able to manipulate pressure, I'd be able to fly in space, myself, or, be something as simple as, if someone is like hurt and they're having like, I don't know, their blood is gushing out of a wound, you could always just supply the right kind of pressure to kind of get everything back in there and help save them. So it's like, it's like being able to kind of like manipulate that very, very tiny aspect of existence. I'd love to be able to do it because the possibilities for me are endless.
Yeah. That's cool. Flying and pressure. Those are, I don't know that I would have pegged you for flying, Beacon, and I don't know that I would have pegged pressure. I don't know that I ever would have guessed pressure ever in my wildest dreams.
Initially it was gravity, but I'm like, well, what is gravity if not just pressure?
What is gravity if not pressure or persevering?
I'm gonna disclose an embarrassing personal story about Star Trek: The Next Generation, because we've talked about, Vega and I have talked about it so much. Beacon, are you not a TNG fan? I just quickly, I want to know if I should.
I'm upset that I have not been a part of these conversations, because I fucking grew up on TNG and I grew up on Deep Space Nine. So fuck all y'all for having a private little conversation.
Yeah, I feel like, Beacon, you should have been more present, because my experience with Star Trek has been so small. So
interesting. Yeah. I grew up with Star Trek TNG too. I didn't like Deep Space Nine as much. I will admit, I'm not a big Deep Space Nine fan. I know that people tell me that I should give it a chance, and Black Commander, like all the stuff that people tell me about why I should love Deep Space Nine, but I feel like them being stationary makes it not exciting or interesting for me. But what I will say about TNG is that
Defiant comes in. She's a tough little ship.
Yes. when they have like little episodes where they're able to get away from being in the stationary starship. But I just feel like that stationary business, I was like, that's what it feels like to be on Earth. That's not what I want to dream about when I'm watching sci-fi. But I grew up on TNG. I love TNG. I wanted to be Jean-Luc Picard as a kid. I wanted to like say engage, like all of the things. And number one, Riker was not on my list of like people on the ship that I would bang as a young gay child. But when he grew the beard, oh my God, I was like, that's when I should have realized I was a bear. That's when I should have realized that I was a fucking bear. He grew a beard, and I was like, oh, where have you been during this whole entire show?
That was the same thing.
I literally, the first season, like, it's so difficult for me to watch sometimes because I'm just like, I don't like you, Riker. And then, like, the beard comes in, and it's like, why am I okay with this all of a sudden?
Yeah.
It's the same thing on Deep Space Nine when Cisco had hair up here but no hair down here, and then it switched. That's when it was like, oh, hello, Captain.
Oh,
it became a lot more attractive.
Whoa!
Yeah.
Maybe I will give Deep Space Nine another chance.
Yeah. And he also got his promotion from commander to captain. I don't know if that helped, but it definitely seemed like it did.
Did he get a promotion from commander to captain? Captain of what? Captain of the spaceship, of the space station?
Well, I think it was because when they got the Defiant, then it was like, okay, now there's a spaceship to be, a captain of. So I think that might have been when the promotion happened. I can't recall.
I see. So. I've tried to watch the Picard series, but it feels very rough to me.
And I'm more looking forward to the second season.
It gives me the same season's feeling as like the rest of the new Star Trek, is that like the thing that I liked about Star Trek was the possibilities and the experience, what it would be like to experience new things that we're not capable of, perceiving from this perspective. Like, the philosophy behind it, the difficult decisions that sometimes came in when you have to deal with the different cultures. Like, that's the stuff that I liked about it.
Yeah.
And with Star Trek Picard and Discovery to some extent, it just feels like they're so intent on trying to be television entertainment. And not to say that, things that aren't aware of it being episodic television can't be good.
Yeah.
But that's not what drew me to Star Trek.
Yeah. There was also a lot of sexual freedom in Star Trek. There was like always this freeness in like these sexually free galaxies with like, I was like, there's always a scene in one of the quarters with someone making out or doing this whole hand grab.
Right.
If you think about it, the kind of kinky sex that you could have, like, just exploring different cultures and figuring out how they interact with each other, it would be interesting.
PoGo Podcast quickly devolved
into Star Trek sex files.
into the Star Trek. Oh wow. Cue the X-Files music. Thank you so much for your time and labor and your energy today, and for ending on a very good light note after a very heavy hour and a half. Have a good night and a good rest of your weekend, everyone. We'll be back here next week. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.